Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Frank Ravitch and I are continuing our discussion of key cases from our casebook, Law and Religion. Today, we are going to be talking about praying. Not the way we're praying in 2021, but the big bang, really, the big bang of, and it's hard to believe it was what, 1963, good Lord.
Wow. Yeah,
The
that's
big bang of the modern culture wars around prayer, the political and societal repercussions of which long existed even after these cases became nothing more than historical artifacts. But they're more than historical artifacts, of course. They are still vital to the canon, although in more and more interesting ways. So we are going to be talking School District of Abington versus Shemp. And by way of the, and some people I know say Abington, some people say Shemp. I like to say Abington, but we're talking about the same case. And by way of this case, we will also talk about its mommy and daddy, and that is the Engel case as well. And so I want to start out, Frank. So situate this case for us, and how you approach it, how you deal with it, and what you think is important to extract from it, and then from it the Engel case.
yeah. We've got a couple of things going on in this case. The namesake of the case, Abington Township v. Shemp, is the first of two cases that are actually involved in this case. And so the school district, Abington School District, required Bible reading and the Lord's Prayer. And so this was very common during that time, but there were a few interesting things here. It required Bible reading without comment. And you have to understand, for those who are not familiar with Catholic history in the United States and around the world, this was actually, these rules about reading the Bible without commentary were sort of a backhanded slap at the Catholic community, because prior to Vatican II, Catholics could only read the Douay version of the Bible. After Vatican II, you could read other versions, but they had to have commentary. So by requiring this, it was already somewhat discriminatory against Catholics. The other thing going on here, if you read footnote, in fact, I always tell students, read footnote 3 in Abington Township, and then in the next chapter in Doe v. Santa Fe, read footnote 1. And what you're going to see is this consistent theme of school prayer being almost weaponized against religious minorities. In this,
right, and not just them, we cannot forget one of the great historical personalities of this battle,
Madeleine Murray O'Hare.
Madeleine Murray O'Hare. Yeah,
the Baltimore case.
We cannot talk about this, right? This is we're dealing here with the treatise of really the end of anti-Catholic, institutional anti-Catholicism. But at the same time, on that funeral pyre is born a robust atheist movement that is now muscular enough to produce, over the course of half a generation, a number of significant interventions. So we cannot pass this case without at least invoking.
Oh yeah, I was going to mention the Baltimore situation next. The one final thing on the Abington situation to mention is that the plaintiffs in this case were Unitarians. And so they were afraid also, though, that because they did not want to take part in the sectarian exercises, that their children would be targeted, and during the Red Scare would be targeted as for being different, which is what school prayer tends to do. Organized school prayer tends to put a target on the backs of those who are different. Well, that brings us directly to the Baltimore case involving Madeleine Murray O'Hare, who was a leader in the atheist movement. And at that time, today, if you're atheist or agnostic, it's really generally depending. I mean, I guess there's a few parts of the country where you might still have issues, but today it's really, more than 25% of the American population today identifies as nones, no connection to religion. But back then in the 60s, I mean, this is before I was born. I mean, in the early 60s, you're coming out of the Red Scare. So being an atheist not only was something that was very, very different. I mean, there were many, many atheists who I'm sure were just, closeted, unfortunately. But it also could connect you to being sort of like communist, right? We all know that while communists, with the exception of Vietnam, which is an interesting story, but while communists tend to be atheists, most atheists are not communists. But back then, that kind of common sense distinction didn't really exist. So Madeleine,
but it was also built into the ideology. The Soviet Union was aggressively and officially atheist state.
Yeah.
The detritus, again, is my word for the day, of Marx's notion of religion as the opiate of the people, and the use of religion as how you other the evils of communism, and then contrast it to, ourselves, where multiple religion and God-fearing, and in a sense, did the Catholics a favor, because that old war had to stop in light of a new common enemy. And we see this over and over again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where enemies all of a sudden become the best of friends because both of them are confronted with something unexpected and something new, but which then binds them together. So,
well, yeah, you see the Knights of Columbus working with a lot of the Protestant leaders in the Congress during the 1950s to, everybody was falling over themselves to talk about God to show they were not communist. And so it was sort of I don't know if you would, atheism was viewed as a sort of buzzword for communism. Of course, we know that's not true. We know that while the Soviet Union was aggressively anti-religion and atheist, the vast majority of atheists had nothing to do with that. So, but Madeleine Murray O'Hair, we tend to underestimate how brave these families were at that time. I wrote an entire book on what happens to religious minorities even today when they protest school prayer. Today it's unconstitutional. Here we didn't know. So these families were very, very brave. But the Baltimore policy was very similar to the Abington policy. But the Lord's Prayer was an even bigger issue there. So that's sort of the backdrop to the cases. And this case came on the heel of the Engel v. Vattel case, where the Supreme Court, without giving any legal tests, said just separation essentially prevents the government, in that case, the New York regents, the education board, from drafting prayers and requiring anybody to say them, right? That was non-sectarian. Here now we have sectarian stuff going on. And so this case comes on the heels of the first case.
Right. But I just to plug Engel again, only because I love that case a lot. The notion of the good mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts of a state or of the national government to begin creating quasi-religious invocations as a means of cobbling together became, in a sense, almost a poison chalice. They had to figure out a way of saying, well, no, it's establishment when the state purports to do anything that looks like religion, but none of this has anything to do with either in God we trust or one nation under God, right? The pledge, and so it was a little funky, but and that one was fairly straightforward. There, and in
well,
a way,
see, in this case, in Abington, Justice Brennan's concurring opinion is so heavily focused on those sort of historical carve-outs that Engel was sort of able to get around a bit, because Here they were trying to, in Ingle, they were, even though it was a non-sectarian prayer, they were drafting a prayer.
Right.
The government was drafting a prayer. But in the context of Abington, Justice Brennan, and he later said he really regretted that part of the concurring opinion where and we'll talk about this in a future video, but they tried to carve out this concept of ceremonial deism, right? Stuff that looks a lot like school prayer, but it's okay because it's not. I mean, it's more complex than that.
Right. Stay tuned, folks. We are going to talk ceremonial deism.
We are. We can call that the incoherence discussion because the concept of ceremonial deism is incoherent and it raises a lot of interesting questions. So stay tuned for that.
I am going to wear my ceremonial costume. The phrase is just so evocative. It's a wonderful turn of phrase. I just can't do it without being.
I'll have to pull out my Harry Potter costume for that because without some kind of magic, I don't know how we're going to make it coherent. I can't wait to see your costume though. We'll do that up
for my comment. All right, so back to the case.
Back to Abington. So Abington, what's fascinating about Abington, and I mean, there's so many fascinating things going on here. But the trial court in Abington, in both cases, you've got a much more robust record in the Pennsylvania case.
Yeah.
But one thing that is clear in both of these cases is that, the school boards are arguing that, look, we need a way to sort of solemnize the school day, and the school prayer, they're arguing, allows us to solemnize the school day. And it's good for student behavior and things like that. And so the court really needed a way to grapple with this. Ingle gave a historical reason for rejecting it. You see in Justice Brennan's concurring opinion where he cites lots of state Supreme Courts from the 19th century and early 20th century where state Supreme Courts held, look, this stuff discriminates against people who are not part of the mainstream religion, and it violates the state constitution, whether it was Ohio or Louisiana or whatever the case may be, Wisconsin.
Right. But stay tuned, folks, because that doesn't apply when it's a holy person going into Congress.
Tom agrees.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, that's a case we will definitely talk when we get to legislative prayer. Legislative prayer, we could just give you we'll get you hungry for it, but won't answer the question until we get to legislative prayer. But legislative prayer is different, is the best way to put it. Whether it really is or not is a different question, but the court treats it differently. So basically, what's interesting about Abington is the court for the first time really, it gives the historical reasoning that we saw in Ingle, that, history demands separation. As we talked about in Everson, though, there's a historical argument on the other side. And if both historical arguments are strong, then at best they cancel each other out. And what courts are relying on is really something else. Well, Abington, the court actually, Justice Clark kind of tells us a little bit about the something else. And that's actually quite helpful. Yeah. So, he talks in the opinion, Justice Clark, when, look, we're a religiously pluralistic society. We've got to navigate this religious pluralism, and having these sorts of prayers and Bible reading during the school day, which was already discriminatory against people who couldn't say the Lord's Prayer, anybody who wasn't Christian, and the Bible reading was problematic for Catholics. It was, as a Jewish witness at the trial court pointed out, a Jewish scholar, it's nonsense from a Jewish perspective to read the Bible without commentary, because the whole thing about in Judaism is you study the Bible. It's not, you can't do it without commentary. So there was all of that. But what Clark was really saying is, look, we need to apply these broad principles from the framers, this concern about factionalism, this concern about dominance and things like that. And we need to find a way to address it in this context. And we get our first legal test.
Yes.
Right? Abington Township v. Shemp. If you are already familiar with the Lemon test, you will recognize this test because Lemon took the first two prongs of the Lemon test from Abington Township v. Shemp. Is there a secular purpose? And is the primary effect one that advances or inhibits religion? And this is really the first statement of a relatively clear legal test. And how the court approached this in the context of school prayer is very interesting, because today we take it for granted that there's no secular purpose. We've seen it reinforced every case. I mean, the one thing that's consistent, there's two things that the Supreme Court has been consistent about in law and religion. One is, no matter how it's come up, school prayer is always unconstitutional. Number two,
which is actually the test now.
Yeah.
School prayer, then the answer is no. The Lemon test is an elegant explanation, at least initial explanation, but absolutely right, Frank. The case reduced to its absolutely simplest is, if we find that this can be characterized as school prayer, boom, you lose.
Pretty much. And we see that even when later tests like the endorsement test and the indirect coercion test come up, the results are the same. The other area where the court's been consistent, we'll look at later, is that religious groups are allowed to access any open or public forum on school campuses. So you can't exclude the Fellowship for Christian Athletes if you allow the key.
As long as, and now we have the birth, this is like the birth of Venus. And now we have the birth of what is going to eventually become the contemporary notions of neutrality.
Yeah, and we do see the discussion in going specifically in Abington. There is this discussion of neutrality as well, which we saw in Everson. We saw a bit in Ingle, but the court grapples with all of this. And interestingly, it says, look, there are ways you can't use a religious means to achieve a secular purpose. So even taking for granted that solemnization is an appropriate secular purpose, there are non-religious ways to meet that purpose. So we see in Justice Brennan's concurring opinion.
Great. I wanted you to get there. All right. Now, finally, I've been dying to ask you this question. All right. I say, I am a clever lawyer, and even more clever, maybe. We'll see. You're going to shoot me down. But I'm a really clever lawyer. I read this and I understand everything we've just said. I said, no problem. All right, we can't do prayer. We're going to solemnize the morning by reading literature. And with the literature we're going to read is literature that speaks to religion.
This is interesting. We're going to give you a contrast here that I think will be very helpful for students and also for faculty that are interested in this. On the one hand, the easy way to deal with that is a moment of silence law. Without what you're talking, I'll address what you're talking about in a second. And as you'll learn when we get further ahead to Wallace v. Jaffrey, unless you do what Alabama did in that case, most moment of silence laws are perfectly constitutional. There are some exceptions.
Badly executed, badly argued.
Exactly. And there's a couple of other minor, but generally that's okay. So that would be a way to solemnize theoretically without promoting religion. So what about this idea of
I'm going to read you Shakespeare, or worse, I'm going to read you passages from the Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, right? See, all of which then, I'm going to give you full-on theology and with Bible quotes, but it's going to be quoting literary works.
Yeah, I think that we actually do have some examples here that would suggest that this is unconstitutional. But we don't know.
But here it would be an intent thing. So
right, exactly.
In fact, I am really clever, and I never say that's what I'm doing, but I choose this with the understanding that we are doing this for the edification and the appropriate mental state of students coming in. But these are the things that we happen to do. And if I'm really clever, I'll also spice it with stuff that is harder to clearly denominate as religion. It is
I think
inject.
there's methods to still deal with that. If you look at, for example, the Ten Commandments case, McCreary County, right? The court can look at intent. Also, we see this in the moment of silence case, Wallace v. Jaffrey. The court can look at intent through things other than bold statements of intent. You don't have to be, I'm doing this to promote religion. In fact, smarter individuals wouldn't do that, right? So what you can look at is, well, okay, this is what you selected. Why does it all have, even if it's far off the mark, religious references? There's lots of other literature. Now, what I would say is that's based on the precedent now.
Right.
We don't know where the current court would go with that, right? We do know that in both lower federal courts and federal courts of appeals, that these sort of Bible as literature classes have been struck down when, the rule
Right.
generally with these things is teach it, don't preach it, right? And so, if it was subtle enough, even if the court 5 years ago might have found it unconstitutional, we don't know what would happen today.
Right.
However,
I would have money. I would have money on an outcome.
I would probably agree with you on that. The one way, though, if they wanted to really be smart about it and make it sort of almost challenge free, the way they would do it is integrate in a number of things that don't have religion mentioned in them at all. So, if you're going to do, parts of Shakespeare, or if you're going to do other literature or inspirational literature, you'd mix it in. So you'd still get your religious stuff in there, theoretically. Right. But, with that said,
well, what about, but hold on a second. So, all right, now it's getting interesting. What if instead of doing that, right, because part of the problem is theology and cosmology. Right. What if I say, fine, that wasn't my purpose anyways, theology and cosmology. My purpose is morals and ethics. What if instead what I do is pull morals and ethics that are deeply grounded in religion and then use that as my moment of entry in?
Yeah, that if you separate it, look, you get like John Finnis and scholars like that
that's where I was hoping you were going to go.
Yeah, look, I'm not a natural law person, right? I'm a Gadamerean, right? So, but if you read Finnis, he's really struggling to make essentially clearly Catholic natural law into sort of a secular principle. And you could see people, although I would assume that most people are not as smart. I mean, Finnis is I may disagree with him quite a bit, but he's a super bright scholar. And, I don't know the school board's going to do as good a job of it, but you could see people using, moral theory that is tinged from particular religious traditions. And I think with the current court, in past years, there may have been ways to draw that out. The courts was less formalistic on these things, but with the current court, I don't think there's any way that gets struck down. Right now, you're going to get in a lot of districts, you'll get a lot of parental complaints, right? So there may be reasons why districts wouldn't do it, but you could certainly see it being done. Right. The interesting thing is I had an experience when I testified before the Michigan legislature on a 10 Commandments bill. And my question, and this is directly relevant to your question, is which version of the commandments are you talking about?
That's right. Catholic, that's right. I remember
Protestant, that. But what it ended up doing was it got the legislators promoting this were mostly either Protestant or Catholic, and they sort of got into a little bit of a discussion with each other about which version. And that might be an issue for any school district, even if you just go Protestant, right? I mean, if you've got a district that's heavily mainline Protestant and heavily Southern Baptist, what moral theory is it that you're going to be able to glean that isn't going to cause a lot of complaints? But that's a practical concern. Legally speaking, I think you're right in that latter scenario. We can call it finishing it. right? So if they finesse it, and if they're as clever as finesse is, I think that they might be able to get it past scrutiny. And I don't think Abington would change that.
That's right. And that's a critical point for people who read these cases. And again, we started a little bit by mocking the cases. They're grandmas and granddads cases. But in a sense, the purpose of my question was to remind people that that is not necessarily true, and that these cases remain both useful, viable, and as barriers that may be overcome, and that given the changing nature of the tenor of the court, things that you might have thought were settled by 1966 may no longer be settled, and the ways in which you approach them, you get around them, you understand their limitations and scope, may be changing dramatically. And
yeah, I think
over the course of the last
true.
3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, these cases are still good law. They're still cited quite a bit, Abington and Ingle. And yet we're in a place now where we just don't know how. I don't see the court overturning them, but the trend with the Roberts Court is to tiptoe away from things so that you don't notice you're really moving away from them. And so I don't know how this will play out. I think school prayer, qua school prayer, will remain, organized school prayer will remain unconstitutional.
Yeah. No, that will be that. It's so stable, and this one is so easy.
Yeah.
And as long as there are ways around it, that's where we're going to be fighting at the edges of this thing. But I think you're right. The kernel stays.
Yeah.
Even with this court.
But the variations are going to be the interesting question.
That's right. And that's where we're going to see action at the district court levels, at the appellate court levels, as people begin to become more empowered to think about ways of getting through them. And again, remember, everyone, we're not dealing here in your local bakery, the battleground here. And we're going to make that distinction later on in the course of the semester. The battleground here are schools. Yeah. And the battleground here is not just schools with a bunch of bored teenagers, but schools with the most impressionable children, right? We start at elementary school. It gets a little iffy, although we've been infantilizing our high school people for the last generation. So who knows, maybe they'll be treated like 6-year-olds too. But that group, colleges are different, businesses are different, the legislature is different. And even though we have a principle here, that principle itself will be understood and applied differently in different contexts.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. We've seen that with, schools are different. The court has, in fact, in a few cases like Levy-Weissman, which we'll be looking at soon, Santa Fe v. Doe, but also, in cases that like Stone v. Graham, which is an early 10 Commandments case, we get the clear statement that schools are different. But what that does is, as Larry points out, is that leaves open lots of other things that where the current court might move. Now, we don't know. Yeah. But one of the fun things, I guess you can say, about studying law and religion is the one thing we can say is it has never been frozen. It has never been a static field. And so there is that we're never bored in this field.
That's right. And of course, hold on to your hats, because once we move beyond the traditional fights between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, and bring in Islam, Satanists, religions from East Asia, South Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, things are going to get much more interesting.
Yeah, and you see that rules that were originally used to hurt Catholics and Jews then begin to get used to hurt a lot of these other groups, as well as atheists and agnostics.
Right.
And we also see, and this to me is something we see frequently in the school prayer area, is also everybody's a religious minority somewhere.
Right.
So we see in this famous case out of Oklahoma from the 1980s, Bell v. Little Axe, where members of the Church of the Nazarene were horrifically persecuted by the local Southern Baptists, not Southern Baptists as a whole, because of a disagreement over religious exercises in the schools. And there was significant violence against the family that were members of the Church of the Nazarene. And we see that reflected 20 years earlier in footnote 3 in Abington Township v. Shemp. Yep. And you'll see it 20 years later in Santa Fe v. Doe when you read footnote 1, where you've got the local school district trying to find out who these people challenging the school prayer is and threatening them with violence.
That's right.
And Bell v. Little Axe is a district court opinion, but it's in the sort of in the middle. It shows it just never stopped.
That's right. That's right. And then enter the WICCA, enter everyone else, and all of a sudden one begins to understand how from all of this we move full centering is notions of neutrality and its ramifications, and the ramifications of which remain quite volatile.
Yeah, and one of the very many very brave plaintiffs that we're going to see challenging some of the most ridiculous behavior on the part of local government is a Wiccan in the Wynn case.
Yeah, one of my favorites.
The bravery that she showed to stand up in Great Falls, South Carolina. And we'll see the plaintiffs shift and ebb and flow. But one thing that you see is it takes a hell of a lot of bravery to stand up to some of the things that we're going to see in the Establishment Clause area, and also for some of the things we're going to see in the free exercise area. And we underestimate, how many cases may never be heard because people are terrified that their house is going to get firebombed if they complain.
That's right. And they will move instead, or they will remain silent. The plate of where that happens changes dramatically between the 60s and now, but we will see it some more. All right. Yeah. We are right out of time. Wait, last words. Right.
Remember when you think back at Abington, this is the case where you get your first real sort of test, right? What is the purpose? Is there a secular purpose? Solemnization was not a secular purpose here, or if it was, you can't use a religious means to fulfill it. And what is the primary effect? In this case, it would have been religion, but the primary focus was on the purpose.
Right. And for me, it's neutrality and how can you wiggle? Now that we have a test, how can you wiggle around it?
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing
what is neutral?
That's right.
Where is the Archimedean point from which we can say anything is neutral in this field?
Oh my God, with 2 lawyers on the Zoom, we'll never find it. All right. Well, stay tuned to the next one, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.